Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. We will get started at the top of the hour, so sit back and listen to some relaxing music, and we'll get started as quickly on the top of the hour as we can. Retrace the memories in the shadow. Consider that my time away was working for.
You must have taken your plants back outside, Shannon.
I did.
Not winter anymore. Yeah.
I did. It finally got warm enough to move them outdoors.
I miss the plants.
Oh, yeah. They look good on camera, but
did.
they took up a lot of space in the office.
Yeah.
So I had to move them out. And with everything going on right now with showing the house and getting photos, I had to clear some space.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I used to be able to have live plants in my house until I got the cat I have now, and he just eats all of them. And most indoor plants are poisonous. So.
Yes, they are.
So they all live outside now.
Thanks for joining, everyone. I see we have some attendees on the call. We have just a few minutes before we jump in, so feel free to sit back and relax, and we'll jump into everything at the top of the hour. Hi, everyone. I see we have a few people on the call already, so stay with us. We'll start as quickly as possible. I know a lot of people have meetings that typically go to the very top of the hour, so let's give them maybe 1 minute past the hour, and then we'll get started. So appreciate you joining us today, and we'll start very shortly. I see the clock just clicked 11, so let's give it 45 more seconds, everyone, and then we'll jump in. I'm sure everyone's got back-to-back meetings today. If you do, you're at the right place today because we're going to talk about eliminating meetings. Let's give it 30 more seconds, guys, and then we'll jump right in. Connor, are we all set up and ready to go on the slide presentation?
Yep, we are good to go.
All right. Kendall, your mic working?
Yep.
All right. It looks like we have everything working from a technical side. So how about we dive in, guys?
All right.
So before we get started, everyone, first off, let me thank you all for spending time with us today. I know most calendars are already packed with your status meetings, your approval reviews, your planning calls, right? So the fact that you chose to spend this hour with us talking about meetings is a little bit ironic, but we hope and we're very sure that it's going to be worth it. So what we want to do today is just really question, I guess, what many leaders, I should say, are asking right now. And, like, why do teams feel like they're constantly busy, constantly coordinating, constantly in meetings, but the work really itself doesn't really seem to move any faster? I think we've all probably run into those types of situations. And when that happens, like, most teams assume that maybe it's a issue of communication. But what we really often find is that meetings are really usually covering for something else that's missing in the workflow. So next slide, please, Connor. So let's first start off by just introducing our speakers today. And for those who do not know me or haven't been on one of my prior webinars, my name's Shannon Riley. I've spent over the past 25 years really working inside a lot of marketing teams and really alongside leadership teams across industries like healthcare, SaaS, and a lot of Fortune 200 organizations. And one of the patterns that I saw repeatedly is that when teams start scaling, that coordination becomes much harder and work starts to become less visible. And you have all of these requests coming from everywhere, and your approvals slow things down. And really, the default way that teams try to fix that is by what? You guessed it, adding meetings, right? So a lot of the work that I focus on now is just really helping teams fix that structure, if you will, behind the work so that meetings are not doing all of that heavy lifting. And I have the honor of having Kendall Elliott with me today. And Kendall has worked really closely with marketing and creative teams, and all teams for that matter, and really trying to solve exactly this problem. She spent a lot of her time helping these teams improve how work really actually flows across things like the request, projects, and approvals. And so that coordination doesn't really depend on constant check-in. So, Kendall, before we dive into kind of the structure behind meetings, like, let's maybe ask, what are you hearing most often from leaders right now about how their teams are operating? If you wouldn't mind sharing some insight with us.
Yeah. For context, most of my experience has been at startups, and Shannon has a lot of experience with enterprise, so we're going to be talking about both here. But for sure, I always see more meetings pop up on calendars because people think it will move the work forward. And all it does typically is keep teams from moving the work forward. So you have all these deadlines and they keep piling up. And as a leader, you don't know why your team isn't, making everything happen. And so you have more and more meetings, and it's really counterproductive. And I think it's not something we always think about, and it's something we should think about more.
Absolutely. I think one of the key things to emphasize is, and I talked about this on the intro, right? Like, the meetings themselves are rarely the root issue. Like, they're usually filling gaps where, a lot of visibility or structure is missing. So that's kind of really the idea that we want to explore today with everybody. Most teams try to solve this whole overload by cutting meetings directly, right? Just cut them off. But what we're going to discuss instead is really what happens when you fix that underlying structure itself that created those meetings in the first place. So before we go deeper into that, I'd like to just give you a real few different stats to start off with. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, Connor, I'd love to share and really kind of ground us in something that's very real today, right? This isn't just a feeling. Like, most teams aren't just busy, they're spending a significant portion of their week in meetings, right? And so when you look at this chart, one thing that stands out is, on average, professionals spend somewhere between 30 to 50% of their time in meetings. If you think about that, I know a lot of us aren't working 40-hour work weeks, right? You're working 50, you're working 60. Think of how much time is spent there. So it's not just 1 or 2 hours here, it's 30 to 50% of your time. And if you're on a 40-hour work week, right, that can be 20 hours a week. That's pretty significant. So if you think about your own calendar, having half of that week spent taking up the work instead of actually doing the work is pretty problematic. And what makes this a little bit more concerning is that a large percentage of those meetings are considered, and I've even been in them, unproductive, right? So there's really no clear decision. There's no clear outcome. And a lot of times you have the same conversation happening over and over again at those meetings. So this is where you really start to see things like status meetings that, repeat all of the same updates. How many of us have been in these approval check-ins that really don't actually move any decisions forward? Or maybe even think about like planning meetings that exist just to kind of help you organize the work that's already in progress and in motion, right? So when we start to talk about this meeting overload, it's not just a time problem, it's really a signal. And that signal is something in kind of how that work is structured and isn't really working the way that it should. So that's really the idea that we're going to explore today, why meetings keep showing up and really what's actually causing them underneath the surface. So next slide, please. And most calendars include, I would think, and hopefully this is the same for you, some version of these types of meetings, right? Status meetings, status updates, approval reviews, planning calls, and quick syncs. Now, when we think about it, like individually, they make sense, right? But over time, they really start to stack on top of each other. And then suddenly, a large portion of your week, that 50% of your week, is spent doing all the coordinating work instead of doing the work. So what I'd like to do is just start off with a quick poll. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please, Connor. I'd like to ask all of you a quick poll question. And if you wouldn't mind pulling that up, it's going to ask what percentage of your week is spent in meetings about work versus actually doing the work. So let's take a moment and select the option that just feels closest to you guys. Let's see what we get. I had a feeling it would be kind of high here. Looks like so far we got 50 to 75% as the winner. Well, it's evening out a little bit on the 25 to 50. Got 60% of the vote coming in. We got a few more of you on the call that we'd love to see your insight here. Just tell us, what percentage of your week is spent in meetings about work versus actually being able to get the work done. All right, looks like things slow down a little bit. Oh, look at that. The winner switched to 25 to 50%. It's still a significant amount, right? And this is probably one of the more common ranges we see, right? It means kind of your team is maybe balancing coordination and execution, but it also can suggest that a lot of operational clarity really still depends on having some of those conversations. So let's go to the next slide. So what I'd like to do is, when we look at teams that are overloaded with meetings, there's usually 3 structural issues underneath. And I love this visual because it just kind of shows, you see kind of the small problem on the top of the water, but underneath there's a lot more going on. When you think about not having communication problems, but having more structural problems, there's 3 common ones that we see. And those 3 are a lack of visibility into the project status, broken intake, right, for new work coming in, and an approval process that's really unclear. And when those areas are unclear, meetings start to do what? They start to multiply, right? Because people need another way to stay aligned. And that way is by having more meetings. So, Kendall, I want to come back to you and just kind of ask, when you start working with a team, you talked about you worked with a lot of startups, so it's a perfect example. And when you start to work with those teams that feel like really meeting heavy, and I'm sure there's a lot of meeting heavy situations in startups, like which of these issues that we just talked about usually show up first?
I mean, it's definitely visibility. I think that's where like the crux of all these meetings start is that people don't know where project statuses are. People don't know, where people are spending their time. And so you add more and more meetings and they pile up, and some of those meetings could end up being 5 minutes, but like the context switching between the work you're doing, going to a 5-minute meeting and coming back, still quite a heavy cost. I would say most of them usually end up going past the meeting time though. So it's really hard to kill meetings when you don't have visibility into what your team is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really important one myself. And, and many times when that's happened, one of the things that is happening, and maybe it's happening to all of you on the call today too, is your leader starts to ask you for frequent status updates, right? And the reason they ask you for frequent status updates is because they don't have that visibility, right? So it's really an important part of this whole structure that we're going to talk about today. And the other thing I think that's really interesting, and when you have these structural misalignments, if you will, think about when somebody asks for a status, right, on something. What typically happens? A meeting's going to happen, right? So that's kind of a key thing that I want you to walk away from this slide. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry.
I think another thing to point out here too is that this is about expectations, right? And your boss expects to be able to see into what your team is doing. And when you don't meet those expectations, 100% of the time your boss is going to be unhappy. So it's also about setting up those expectations so that you're setting yourself and your team up for success.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can do a really important thing here when you are able to do that, and that's reduce your risk, right? And if you think about like a chart, and you think about time, and you think about risk, like the less visible that is available, the more risk you end up facing, right? And so it's really key here to think about the risk, think about that visibility, and think about what triggers it and what the outcome is of those discussions. And it usually leads to some type of a meeting or an update. Absolutely. Connor, would you mind going to the next slide, please? So we talked about structure, right? I want to talk about those three structural areas, right, that we see across most teams. And the first one we're going to talk about is just what we kind of segued in from the last slide, and that's visibility, right? Most teams technically have, the ability to have some of that visibility, right? And think about Workzone. Think about work management applications like a Monday or an Asana, right? You might have those tools available to you, but maybe you only have one person or a couple people using it, and others on your team aren't using it at all. So your meetings are still going to stay the same because you don't have that visibility that you need to across your different departments, right? Really having that ability to track those projects, really have the ability to make sure that the information that you're sharing isn't incomplete or outdated, or as I just said, right, difficult for others to access. Everybody needs to be working from that single source of truth. And so as a result of that, people end up relying on conversations, right, to really understand what's happening. If you don't have something in front of you like a calendar and not know what's going on, then the natural tendency is going to be to have some of those conversations and even more meetings. So this is where like many of those status meetings start to begin, right? Kendall, I want to come back to you. When you look at teams that feel really meeting heavy, right? Like what usually tells you that visibility is the issue?
Number of stand-ups is a big one. If you are having a stand-up every single day, a lot of times I see it's because there's no visibility into what's happening. Like all your requests are spread across spreadsheets and emails. And, it was a really good point you brought up about sometimes only one person uses the project management tool your company is using. And if only one person uses it, it goes against the whole theory of it, right? So, but a lot of the tools are really complicated and it is really hard to get adoption. And if you don't have adoption, you don't have visibility, and then you're going to be paying for a tool that nobody on your team is using.
Yeah, absolutely. Status meetings is a good one. I'd be interested if you guys all have a little react button on your webinar, like give us a little hands up if you have constant status meetings. I'd be interested to see how many are running into having these status meetings once or twice a week, like you said, Kendall. Yeah, Richard. Yep, I see a couple thumbs up coming in there. So looks like some of you on the call today are running into the same thing. And if someone needs to ask for a status, I think we talked about this a few slides ago, right? That almost always guarantees a meeting. So, this lack of shared visibility really forces teams to help coordinate through those conversations and additional meetings. So, when that status isn't available, the updates have to happen somewhere, right? And most of those updates happen by default in meetings. And that usually leads to this second structural issue that we're going to talk about and what we see. And if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide for me, Connor. The second one is really how work actually enters the team. And this one is really important. I can't emphasize how important this is because most leaders recognize this immediately. And if you think about how requests come through, I'm sure many of you get them through email and Slack or hallway conversations, or even, your leadership sending you some messages, right? Each of those requests are going to arrive with different levels of detail, different expectations, and a lot of times different urgency levels, right? So I want to bounce it back to you, Kendall. What does that usually look like when you first start working with a team? Like this whole how work is entering to your team, if you will.
Yeah, the first thing I usually see is that there's no single source of truth. So requests are spread across email or Slack or Teams or whatever team your team uses to communicate. And when everything's spread across multiple channels, it becomes impossible to see a holistic view. So that's the first one. The second one I see is that, let's be honest, not all requests are like a priority one, right? And so when there's no filter and there's no visibility coming into the request, everything becomes priority one. That's how your team gets burnt out, and that's how they have no time because they're being spread so thin across all these projects, and half the time their leadership team doesn't even know which projects they're working on because the requests come in from so many channels.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I've seen that in the past, the first thing that I think about is, and the first thing that I see is everyone who's putting a request is of the highest urgency, right? So everything appears to be urgent. And if you think about how we manage that work, and you have everything urgent, well, what happens when you have everything urgent and everything needs to be done at the same time? Well, you start to overload your resourcing, right? You start to put everybody on top of every single urgent project immediately. And then what happens from the result of that is you start to get employee burnout. When you start to get employee burnout, then you start to get, morale starts to come down. So all of these things start to trigger something else down the line in this sequence of events. So, and we've been talking about this for the last few slides, when these requests arrive randomly, like you just mentioned, Kendall, like prioritization itself, that also becomes a meeting. So, this is one of those areas that I think are really important. And, instead of, the system handling prioritization, what happens is the team starts to end up having these conversations just to start to organize the work. And that really brings us to the third issue that drives really a surprising number of meetings. So the next slide, please, Connor. And the third one is approvals, right? I think we've all been a part of this. Work almost always involves multiple stakeholders reviewing, whether it's your content, your campaigns, your creative, before it goes live. I know a lot of you might even have legal involved in those decisions and those workflow approvals. But when that approval process becomes unclear, that review process starts happening in conversations, right? And so I'd like to come back to you, Kendall, and ask, how do you usually see, approval issues show up inside of, whether it be just, a marketing team or any team for that matter?
Yeah. And I will say, Shannon, too, that all of these problems are felt especially like hard on startup teams or like small teams. The smaller your team is, like the more you're going to feel this squeeze. And so when you get into approvals, you're talking about working typically with external collaborators, right? So they might not even be in your internal company, and if there's no place where everybody can see where that file lives, where, you know, who's making it,
Right.
what changes need to be made, if there's nothing like that everybody has visibility into, the approval process will drag on for weeks, and you end up with this like pointing finger blame game a lot of the time, because people are like, oh well, I thought Shannon had it, or oh, I thought Kendall had it, and it's because nobody knows who's doing what.
Yeah, absolutely. The finger pointing is a great point. I mean, I'll confess, guys, like I pointed my finger at the creative team all the time, right? That's the first place I pointed my finger. Why are there delays? Well, the creative team didn't produce what they were supposed to quick enough, but it's not their fault, right? The fault comes into, delays in this process, just ownership delays. That's why it's really important to make sure that you have those ownerships and accountabilities in place so that you can avoid some of this. And when we step back, I think three patterns that we see repeatedly are the lack of visibility, right? The unstructured intake and these unclear approvals. And so we have to think about, each of those gaps that we just talked about in these three structural issues is going to create more coordination, right? And that coordination is always going to show up as meetings. So before we move into kind of how to fix this, right? Let's just see which one resonates best with this group. So guys, eyes back on your screen, time to pay attention again. We're going to go to another poll question. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, Connor, let's do another real quick poll. And the question for the group today is going to be, which of those areas creates the most meetings for your team? We just talked about them: visibility and broken intake and chasing approvals. Let's hear from you guys. Let's see where you're at. So take a moment, just select one that feels most familiar to you.
Yeah, and Shannon, the thing that's always crazy to me is that it doesn't matter what industry you're in. Like, this is present across engineering teams, against marketing teams, like ops teams, like everybody struggles with it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's completely industry agnostic. All right, guys, I see we have the winner is no visibility. Yeah, that's usually the most common answer. I think when teams really just cannot see project status easily, like updates naturally move into meetings. So I think you are all facing the very same challenges and structural issues that we've seen as well. But, I think the pattern is always going to be the same, right? Meetings are always act, I should say, as that whole coordination layer for the work, right? And really what high performing teams do differently is they fix the structure behind that coordination. And that's really important. Fix the structure behind that coordination. So let's talk about what actually changed here and go into some of this. Next slide, please, Connor. One of the most interesting patterns that I've seen is really teams rarely reduce meetings by targeting meetings directly. What they do instead is they improve that structure behind the work. And that's the really important key phrase there. Once the workflow becomes much clearer, the meetings start to disappear naturally, right? So, Kendall, I know you've been through this. We talked about this in preparation for our webinar today. When you've had teams that have started to make some of those structural changes, like what's the first meeting that disappeared for you?
Definitely stand-ups for me.
Yeah.
And, it might be a hot take, but I hate stand-ups. I don't think stand-ups should exist if you have a good like project management system, because that 15 minutes at the beginning of every day, like if you want to have a 15-minute with your team, especially if they're remote and, just to start your day, fine. But that status meeting update could be done async anytime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That was my first response as well, is status meetings. And if you think about all of the thumbs up that we saw from all of you guys on the webinar today, just think about eliminating those status meetings and how much extra time that probably adds to your week. And I'm not talking like a weekly stand-up meeting where it's just at the beginning of the week. I mean, there's usually in many cases, you're having multiple stand-up meetings throughout the day with different stakeholders, with different departments, with different colleagues. So this goes back to what we talked about earlier, right? That visibility and being able to fix some of these structural issues. So I think that's a great example. And so when you think about the status meetings, I think about, Kendall, back to, well, what replaced the status meetings, right? And I had the benefit of using a lot of different work management platforms in the past. And you have shared dashboards that are available, right, to see all of your projects. You have areas where you can just make sure everybody's assigned and somebody's an owner, and you can look at all those different risks that we talked about earlier, right? So the goal that I'm trying to convey here is not fewer updates. It's just, again, back to all of the root issues that we all faced, right? It's just better visibility. So let's go to the next slide, because I want to talk about something that Kendall brought up earlier, and that's the whole difference between like a startup and enterprise. And I've had a lot of experience in enterprise area. And one thing that's really important to call out is that the problem does show up differently depending upon the organization. Some teams think this is a huge, big company problem, right? It doesn't happen to us. And others think, oh, that's just startup chaos. But in reality, both types of teams are dealing with this, right? So if you think about like in an enterprise environment, where do meetings tend to come from? They tend to come from complexity, right? That's a big enterprise issue, right? So you have more stakeholders, you have more approvals, right? You have more reporting expectations. So meetings kind of become the way that teams maintain alignment in an enterprise, right? Sounds familiar to anybody that's an enterprise? And then you think of the startup side, you got smaller, faster moving teams. It does look a little bit different because, priorities shift quickly, requests come from everywhere, and communication is always much more informal. So meetings kind of become the way that teams start to create that clarity, right? But if you think about underneath both of these, it's still the same issue, guys, right? Whether it's enterprise or whether it's startup, it's lack of visibility, right? It's unstructured intake and how that work is being requested. And it's unclear ownership, regardless of the size. So, Kendall, do you tend to see one of these patterns more than the other, given your history and experience?
It's so hard because these are both a problem, and they're a problem in different ways. So on a startup team, for example, yes, priorities shift constantly. When I come into a startup, there's usually no structure at all. You're starting from scratch, the very base. You have to build everything up, which is a blessing and a curse, right? Because you can build it exactly how you like it, and you can set the team up to scale for the future. But it's also a struggle, especially on a small team, when you're building that infrastructure that needs to exist to make sure you can also scale. But then when you get to enterprise teams, usually that structure already exists. The problem comes when it might not be the best structure, and it's really difficult to get it changed then. Enterprise typically tends to be a lot less flexible. They don't really like to, shift priorities, pivot quickly. And when you already have a broken approval or intake or visibility problem, and you're trying to change that at an enterprise-wide level, you're talking typically about months of implementation. So, and that's after you get everybody on board.
Yeah, absolutely. My takeaway from what I just heard is, the environment changes, but the root problem doesn't, right?
Yeah.
So, that's a key takeaway here, guys. So you're exactly right. I think regardless of team size, like the solution isn't fewer meetings by default. It's, again, improving that structure behind how the work flows, right? So let's look at, what that actually looks like and go to the next slide, if you don't mind, Connor. So the first structural fix is what I think all of you raised your hand for earlier, and that's shared visibility, right? So rather than waiting for meetings to understand your project progress, teams create a single place, right, where the current status of work is always visible. I just popped up because, Kendall, you're at Workzone, right? So this probably looks very familiar with you, right? It's a nice dashboard that shows you everything on a screen for what's happening and how far it's through the work stream, who's assigned, all the due dates. So a great way to communicate this visibility to everybody. But let's think about if I could ask you, Kendall, like what changed once that visibility existed?
So I know we've been talking a lot about like leadership in teams, but even like under leadership, your peers and your colleagues, them being able to see what you're working on helps a lot too. Because when the rest of your organization or even the rest of your team can see what you're working on, they'll know, hey, Kendall has too many projects. I can't be asking her, one more thing. This can wait for 2 weeks. Or, hey, I saw you're working on this. I have an asset from a year ago that might be helpful for this. And those are like the small things that do sound small, but can make a huge difference in the amount of time spent on projects or in meetings. And the due dates is also really nice because I think a lot of time, at least for me, I guess, dates tend to sneak up on you, right? And without any warning into, hey, this is due in a week, or hey, this is due in 3 days, suddenly the deadline's there, everything's already late, you haven't even started, and then everybody's unhappy.
Yeah, I can tell you one thing that happened to me personally when visibility existed. My Slack started dinging less. My phone started ringing less, right? My phone started ringing less. And, I just wasn't bothered as much, right? Because if you think about your normal day to day, how many people will reach out to you through a Slack or an email or a phone text or some other way because they're just asking a simple question because they can't remember or they just don't have the visibility, right? What was the due date on that project again? Who was assigned to it? What was I responsible for? If you think about all of those things that I just mentioned, like those would typically require you to have some type of back to your point earlier, Kendall, a stand-up meeting. Let's talk about it, right? So a great way to avoid that. And once the teams and your team start to trust that visibility, many of the status meetings that you guys are all having are just going to start to become unnecessary, right? So let's talk about the second structural fix, which really addresses like how work enters the system. So the next slide, please, Connor. So instead of having requests arriving from all these different places, right? We talked about it, Slack, email. I've even had people write something down on a Post-it note and put it on my computer. And then I get back to my desk and I'm like, who put that Post-it note on my computer? That wants a project request. No other information, just need this done by Friday, right? I think we've all probably had that happen to us. High performing teams, what they do is they create a single structured entry point for new work. And work management is a perfect example of like a best practice way to do this, right? You can even see on the screen an example of one of your request forms, I think that you offer customers, Kendall, that just shows like all the different information that you can capture. So there's a very clear, process and structure to how you're capturing that. But what I'd like to ask, Kendall, is, once, what changed once you started using request and they started to come in, through this intake process when you've experienced this in your past opportunities, if you will?
Yeah, especially at startups, which can pivot so quickly. I would say the amount of time spent on wasted projects like decreased significantly because when you get requests from everywhere, not everybody, not all the stakeholders have visibility into those requests. And you start working on a project, you finish that project, your manager's like, great, this is done. But then the two other stakeholders wanted something completely different. They didn't have visibility into it at all. And so then you've spent a week working on work that's just going to be thrown away. And I think that's always frustrating for people, right? Like nobody wants to spend a week of their time on something that's just going to get scrapped. So that's the number one. Number two, I would say the amount of requests also decreases because when people have to justify their requests and they have to put hard dates and it's not just an idea of like, hey, we could do this or hey, we could do that. Like ideas are cheap, right? But action is everything. And if they can't articulate their request in a way that gives it very, hard deadlines, hard, hard everything, it becomes difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you mentioned this a few slides back too about prioritization, right? And when I think about the intake, like I think that it's much more easier to prioritize when you have this type of a structure in place, right? Because now you have clear definitions of what's needed. You might have clear budget, you might have clear deadlines. And when you have all of that, you start to be able to prioritize things much more easily. So I think it's a great example of how to fix some of these structural issues. And when it becomes structured and this intake process becomes structured, like your teams no longer need those meetings just to organize incoming work. Because think about how many meetings you might have had just to start to organize all of the work. Using this type of a best practice will eliminate that. So let's talk about the third fix. And this is going to focus on approval. So the next slide, please, Connor. And this third change really addresses what I like to call approval bottlenecks, right? So instead of approvals happening more informally through your email threads, right? Teams start to use this to define real clear ownership and different stages for sign off, right? So Kendall, I want to kind of prompt it back to you if I can. Like, what difference does a real clear approval ownership make for the team?
A lot less mistakes, number one. I'm sure, especially on a marketing team, we've all been on teams where flyers have been sent out and there's a typo on the flyer, and you're taking 2,000 of these to a conference that you suddenly need to reprint because the approval didn't have multiple stakeholders or didn't have approval at all. Maybe it was just done and nobody even looked at it before it went out.
Guilty. Been there, done that.
Yeah, so that's number one. Number two does go back into that visibility. Being on startup teams, I personally like the pushback on approval processes. You might not always see that as much in enterprise, but in startups especially, it becomes a lot more collaborative. And I think that can really push a project to its very best. And there's so many times where I've seen a project totally transform for the better when the approval process had complete visibility, multiple stakeholders, lots of people pushing it along.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I think, there has to be a clear ownership and a workflow for that ownership as well. I think back to the enterprise days, I would have teams that had 20 plus people in that approval process, right? And if you think about just one of those people or two of those people or three of those people not having clear ownership throughout that process, that approval process could go from maybe a 5-day process to a multiple week process, right? So it's really important. Like once that visibility, intake, and the approvals start to become all structured, like the total number of those coordination meetings that you're having right now is naturally going to drop. So let's just briefly show what these workflows look like in practice. So next slide, please, Connor. Great. What we wanted to do here is something a little bit more practical from this point, guys. Everyone needs a way to look at their meetings differently. So Kendall actually put this great, simple resource together that's really designed to help you guys take one meeting on your calendar and just kind of rethink whether it should exist at all. So Kendall, since you led the creation of this document and this exercise, I'm just going to hand it over to you and let you kind of walk through how it works.
Yeah. All right. So I feel like a lot of times when meetings go on calendars, nobody asks questions beforehand. Like, is this meeting gonna have a decision attached to it? Is everybody that's going to be involved in the project at this meeting? If not, should we have this meeting? Because if the stakeholders aren't there, then we could be doing the work twice. So there's a list here of things to consider before you press send on that invite. Go ahead and scroll down a little bit, Connor. And then we get into a meeting cost calculator here. So how many attendees are going to be at your meeting? What's their average per hour? And how long is that meeting going to be? Like, that's how much money you could save per meeting, depending on how much time, how many people. And, you know, putting it, especially in these terms, to leadership can be a really powerful metric to be like, we really shouldn't have this meeting. This $600 could be spent elsewhere, right? Go ahead and scroll down a little bit. So could the meeting be async? Definitely don't have it. If it's just a status update, in my opinion, you don't usually need to have that meeting. But say we've answered all these questions, all these people need to be here. This meeting cannot be done async. So what are we going to call the meeting? Who's organizing it, and who are the attendees? Go ahead and scroll down a little bit more. What key decisions have to be made? What is on the agenda? And this is something I don't think we've touched on yet, Shannon, but most, if not all, meetings should have an agenda. So everybody can come into the meeting prepared, and there's no like a 10-minute catch up at the beginning. Everybody already comes in knowing what the project is. You know, they're 100% starting at the meeting, and the time is much more effective. So agenda for sure. And then the decision right here. So what decision was made at this meeting? And then what are the action items attached to this meeting as well? So you can fill all of this out, and then you can also export it at the top with all of your meetings details and everything like that. To me, I put a bunch of my meetings in through here, and I found at least 3 I didn't need anymore just by using this. Because again, when you have to attach like a key decision or key stakeholders or action items and accountability to every single meeting, you know, it really makes you think and be really ruthless about your time. And when you're on a small team, you really just have to be ruthless about your time. Like, you can't be spending all this time in wasted meetings when, you know, you only have 2 people on your team and you're already both doing 3 jobs. So
yeah, I think it's fantastic. I mean, the whole point of our webinar today is to figure out how to reduce meetings, right? Here's a tool for all of you guys to be able to do that, right? And 2 things stood out to me in this, which I think are really important. One is the agenda. I 100% agree. Always come in with an agenda, and always leave with having somebody assigned and being accountable for those action items that come out of the meeting, right? I think those 2 things are really important. The other thing I love about it is the cost, right? If we think about, you know, return on investment, and we think about time spent, what a great way to kind of figure out if it's even valuable enough to have a meeting, right? I've been in meetings where we've had 20 people sitting in a room talking about something. 3 people are talking, the other 17 are listening. So is it really necessary to bring in that many people into a meeting? And that's a great way to kind of equate a value and the cost to having those meetings, and then just eliminating it, like you said, if it's not needed. So it's a great way. And are you going to share this with everybody on the call today as well, Kendall? Is that correct?
Yeah. So everybody who registered will get a link to this that they can use personally for whatever they'd like, whatever meeting they want to cancel and they don't want in their life anymore.
Awesome. Well, thank you for putting that together and sharing it with everybody today. I think once you guys start to think this way, I think it'll become really clear that like the real fix isn't in the meeting. It is. I mean, it is, right? This will help fix whether the meeting is necessary, but it really goes back to what we were just talking about. It's the structure behind the work, and putting all of those different structures in place, and using this great document here to calculate whether it's necessary. Think about what we talked about on one of the first or second slides, 50% of time a week in meetings. Like, this could help eliminate 25 to 50% of that 50% immediately. So what a great document to share. Thank you for putting that together, Kendall.
Yeah. Anything to have less meetings in everybody's life, right?
Exactly. So let's go to the next slide, please. So if we had to summarize, guys, today's discussion, it comes down to a few ideas, right? And that's that meetings are usually a symptom, right? Not a root problem. Visibility reduces coordination, structure removes urgency, and clear ownership speeds up a lot of decisions. And when teams can see the work real clearly, like they don't need to talk about it as often, right? So Kendall, I want to ask you a question again, like what surprised you most when teams started implementing some of these changes?
Projects move forward a lot faster, especially once you get to the approval stage, because I do feel like that's a huge bottleneck for so many teams, whether the approvals on budget or on creative or on an order that needs to be placed. Teams that were spending days and weeks waiting for those approvals before, now we're cutting it down to half or 75% of the time. Which again, when you're on a small team, becomes so important. But I think on a big enterprise team too, that can be really important, right, Shannon?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I've had that situation, and one of the things that happened to me is my leaders started to gain some real confidence in the progress, right? When they started to see all of this visibility and all of this improvement in the process. So the net result is it's not only going to help you guys reduce your time in meetings every week, it's also going to make you look good in front of your bosses, right? Because they're going to have a lot more confidence in things that are happening within your department and your team by having this visibility play across all of your daily work, if you will. Next slide, please, Connor. All right, guys. So we've gotten towards the end of our discussion today, but before we open things up for questions, let's just quickly recap the big idea behind this conversation today. And that is that most teams try to solve meeting overload by reducing meetings directly, right? But what we discussed today is that meetings are rarely the root problem. They usually appear when teams are compensating for that missing structure somewhere in the workflow, right? And the three places that we most often see that are what? Hopefully you guys can recall this, right? Visibility into the project status, how new work enters the team, right? And how approvals are handled. And when those areas are unclear, these meetings become kind of that coordination layer for the work. And when those areas become more visible and structured, then what's going to happen, right? Many of those meetings are just naturally going to disappear. So if there's one key idea we hope you take away from the session today, it's this. You do not fix meeting overload by managing calendars, right? You fix it by improving the structure behind that work. And when visibility improves, that coordination is going to become much easier. And when that ownership becomes clear, what's going to happen is decisions are going to move a lot faster, right? And when all of those things are working well, your meetings stop being that default solution that they are right now. So next slide, please. So if you are watching this webinar today and thinking, your team feels kind of stuck in this meeting overload, like the most important advice I can give to you, just start small, right? We have, a meeting agenda that ends meetings faster, right? We talked about that. So use that device that Kendall built, that document, to be able to eliminate meetings, right? We talked about Workzone today, right? Kendall is at Workzone, and they have a great project management software that allows you to get visibility and manage your intake and do all of these structural fixes. So if you don't use Workzone now, book a walkthrough, right? Schedule a 15-minute demo with someone and just see how it works for you. There's even a free trial, guys, Workzone, I know, just launched a free trial, so you can experience like everything that the platform offers for free. See how it works for you. See how it works for your team. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised on how you can gain back a lot of your time by having this single source of truth platform that you can use with a platform like Workzone. So use some of those resources and see how it works for you. So we want to have, what do we got? 11:51. So let's leave a few minutes for questions, because I know a lot of you are navigating these challenges that we just talked about right now. So we'd love to hear some questions that pop up. If there's a meeting your team that's felt unnecessary or frustrating, like ask us some questions. Or Connor, I don't know if you've had anything come in through the chat while we were talking, but let's go into the Q&A section.
Sure, yeah. Some questions did come in. Here's the first one here. What advice would you give to teams that feel pressure to keep those meetings even when they know they are not the most effective way to share progress?
Yeah, that can be hard, right? And I do think that's where this agenda becomes really helpful. In my experience, when you visualize data, like leadership really responds to that, teams really respond to that, because it's really easy to get like caught up in kind of the abstract of, what harm is a 15-minute meeting actually doing? But once you put time attached to it, money attached to it, it becomes a lot harder to justify. What have you experienced, Shannon?
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think that, when you think about this shift, and if you're not telling leadership, that you're canceling meetings, like the shift is going to always say that you're improving visibility. So I think updates aren't going to require a meeting anymore, right? And when you think about like progress and risk and ownership, they're all going to be visible somewhere. And you can check that anytime, right? And we just talked about, work management and platforms, like having all of that in a central place. You can look at the dashboard. Naturally, when you start to put all of these different structural fixes into place, meetings are going to drop pretty quickly. And I think that's the ultimate goal here. And when you start to drop those meetings quickly, your leaders are going to trust that not only are you solving for that visibility issue, but they're going to trust that visibility exists, and your calendar is going to naturally open up, not just to, having more meetings, but also open up to always having constant check-ins from your leaders, finding out progress and status on specific projects that are happening within the organization as well.
Yeah, you touched on something, Shannon, that I think is really important about trust, because I think a lot of these meetings also start because you can't trust to know where a project status is. You can't trust to know what your team is working on. And so once they start with visibility and you start gaining that trust, those meetings will decrease significantly. And, maybe it'll take a couple weeks, a month, 2 months, but once you build up that trust and you set those expectations, those meetings will start dropping off your calendar.
Absolutely, 100%.
All right. Another question here. When marketing leaders start improving visibility, what is usually the first structural change that has the biggest impact?
Yeah, we kind of touched on this, but approvals for sure. I mean, I can't stress how much time, at least at our organization, that is spent on like approval bottlenecks. And once you can eliminate those bottlenecks, your team moves so much faster. And, it doesn't really matter if you're on a big team or a small team, your resources are finite, and you really need to be using your resources to their fullest extent. And you can't do that if you're just stuck in these approval processes that take weeks that, nobody has visibility into. What about you, Shannon? Have you experienced anything different?
Very similar. I think the other thing is, just the certain views of different statuses, right? I think on one of the slides we showed like a dashboard that had things of what the projects were and what the status was of those projects. Like, I think everyone tracks projects somewhere, right? But a lot of times it's just not really reliable enough for leadership to kind of lean on it. So I just think it's really important in that situation, just, have some type of a dashboard or some kind of a system where you allow yourself and everybody to see what's in progress, right? Show what's at risk. And more importantly, you made this point earlier, like who owns it, right? Like a lot of the questions that normally come up in meetings are those exact things. And when you can eliminate those, you're going to do exactly what we talked about today. And that's hopefully reduce the amount of meetings and or to your document that you created, right? Make those meetings disappear.
Yeah, and something you touched on that we haven't really talked about, Shannon, is that, being reactive versus being proactive. Like if you don't know what's at risk, at what projects are at risk, what team members are at risk on your team from burnout, then these projects are going to fall behind, because when you realize that, a lot of times you realize it's too late then. So
Right.
you're constantly being reactive instead of looking at the projects a week before and being like, hey, like this has 10 tasks that haven't been done. Are we still on deadline for this? I think that can be really important in moving projects along as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right. Time for one more question.
Sure.
All right. And folks, if we don't get to your questions, we will certainly follow up with answers. When you work with teams that feel overwhelmed by meetings, what is usually the first signal that their workflow structure needs improvement?
Everybody coming to the meeting looking overwhelmed and stressed is probably the first one for me, because nobody knows, the meeting probably doesn't have an agenda, so nobody even knows what you're going to be talking about. So are you going to be talking about the project that's already behind schedule, or the ones that you've already done that are stuck in the approval process? That's probably the first one I see. What about you, Shannon?
Yeah, I would agree. I think, when certain information requires a conversation every week, again, it goes back to what I talked about in a few of those structural slides, right? It usually means that structure behind the work isn't really carrying enough of the load. So, we talked a little bit about this, but like high performing teams, tend to make that information visible by default, right? So those meetings can focus more on the decisions instead of updates. And we talked a little bit about this earlier too, Kendall, right? Is stand-up meetings, right? We talked about coming in with agendas. We talked about leaving with clear responsibilities and accountability and assignments. And guys, we got this great new tool that's available to all of us today called AI, right? So if you have in all these meetings, or you have a meeting and you want to summarize that meeting and do it quickly and make assignments, like use some of that technology that's available to us today to help speed up your time in creating some of these follow-ups, so that you can not only eliminate maybe some of these meetings, but you can also use some of these technologies to eliminate some of your time spent to either recap a meeting or to even, maybe create your agendas for the meeting. So just something to think about as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I see we're at the top. If you won't mind going to the last slide for me. First, I want to just thank again everybody for spending the time with us today. Hopefully the biggest takeaway from this session is that you don't have to live with meeting overload, right? As the default model that you've been working with. These small structural improvements can just make a really big difference in how that work's going to flow across your team. And we really appreciate you joining today, sharing your insights through the polls and the questions and raising your hand. Big thank you to Kendall for her conversation today and her insights and experience. And thank you, Connor, for helping take care of all of the back end and moderating, I should say, for the meeting today. So thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week.